Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to talk to you about building cross-border syndicates today. We have a great panel. I'm actually going to let you guys introduce yourself, a little about where you work, and maybe one or two sentences about what cross-border investment means to you and how that's played a role in your recent life.
Well, great. I'm Rob Krummen, the CEO of Vektor Medical. I like to think of Vektor Medical as the Google Maps for cardiac arrhythmias. And you'll hear today about how cross-border syndicates make a big difference in our company's trajectory and our plans for the future.
I'm David Dare. I'm a founding partner, managing partner at SoulSpy Ventures, OB critical care doc by training. And cross-border investing to us is going anywhere outside of the great state of Tennessee and the volunteers. Rob owes me $5. Go ahead.
So you got to end it on that note, are you? Okay.
That's a highlight. I can make €5.
All right.
That's an investor. I mean, I'm making money.
Luc Marengere. I'm a managing partner and co-owner of TVM Capital. We're a transatlantic fund. So we have an office in Munich. We have an office in Montreal. So we invest truly on a transatlantic basis. So European companies that want to build operations in the U.S., and vice versa, of course. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So Alexander, I'm the CFO of Xeltis. We develop artificial vessels that get absorbed by the body and turn into living healthy tissue. And our latest fundraising round included strategics from China and US, and also VCs from Europe and Asia.
Great. Good. Let's start with a little bit of the story of Vektor Medical. You guys raised $16 million back in February. It was a cross-border syndicate. So talk a little bit about that and how that came together.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So one of the things, for all the innovators out there, one of the things I want to discuss is the importance of understanding that every dollar, or here every euro, isn't worth the same amount. You're looking for value-add euros. And our first term sheet for our Series A round came from Dr. Adair here. And after he did his due diligence and we did our due diligence, we realized we wanted to work together. And one of the great things that Dr. Adair did is he said, let's go to LSI Europe and see if we can find a cross-border syndicate. And that's where we got introduced to Luc and TVM Capital. And we really understood. Our very first conversation with Dr. Adair was realizing the opportunity in Europe. And we wanted to be able to leverage both the expertise that we had in the United States and the expertise that existed in Europe. And so it was a match made in heaven, and we're delighted to be sitting with these two gentlemen today and talking about Vektor Medical and cross-border syndicates.
Yeah. David, can you talk a little bit about why you suggested a cross-border syndicate and what kind of led to the coming to LSI?
Mm-hmm. Well, for Vektor, it was a unique situation. Cardiac mapping in Europe really is not something that's done a whole lot. It's mostly fluoro and that kind of thing, which is bad for the patient, bad for the doc. And so at Solus, we always start with the patient first, and then everything else will take care of itself on the back end. I remember the first phone call. I was actually seeing patients. I was on call, and Sunday night, these guys are presenting late at night, and I said, if I get all this right, I think this is great for the U.S., but I said, I think it really is a great value add for the European market. Have you thought about CE? And how do we do that, and so forth? And Rob said, well, wow, you're the first investor that said we ought to be thinking that. And so that kind of sealed the deal for us. We were like, yeah, we want to run two-pronged approach, U.S. and the Europe. So that's how we come together. And then we met Luc here on my left, and we've forged a great friendship, great partnership with Vektor, and looking at more deals.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about how your previous investors felt about the new bringing in outside investors from across overseas? Were there issues? Were there things that they were concerned about? What did you guys have to think about that was different?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our existing investors have been extremely well educated. Most of them are doctors or family offices, and they knew the opportunity that existed in the EU, and so they were delighted for the opportunity. We always work with sophisticated legal counsel, so bringing in cross-border funds wasn't an issue. Now, I will mention for anyone who doesn't have sophisticated legal counsel, I'd recommend you get it, because there's a lot of additional issues associated with investment from outside of the United States. But there's so much value add. It's worth that time and that effort. And it opens doors. Dave and I have a number of contacts that we share in the United States. Luc and I have a number of contacts that he's introduced me to in Europe. And those are priceless insights that you wouldn't otherwise have. So our investors were absolutely supportive of the effort.
Great. Luc, do you want to talk a little bit about what attracted you to Vektor? And again, a syndicate coming from the US, what were the things that you were concerned about or questions that you had?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. To begin with, maybe a little shout out to Scott and Henry because we met Vektor at the LSI in Dana Point for the first time. And in fact, we've ended up investing in 2 companies now that we were introduced to in the context of an LSI conference. So that's great quality coming out of this. So what attracted us to Vektor? So we like, obviously, transformative, differentiated type of technologies and products, okay? I'm going to pick up one point that David made, is talking about the standard of care in Europe. So in this particular case, a US-based company, but we were very intrigued in how that product not only worked in the US, but also would work in Europe. So when we do due diligence on a US-based company, we also test drive the concept from a European point of view as well, right? So we contacted EPs, electrophysiologists, in Europe as well, where we introduced that concept of using V mapping, as you pointed out. You know, it's Google Maps for arrhythmias, right? Burn here, there's your target, okay? And people thought about this for the very first time. The feedback was so overwhelmingly positive that was an important first step, right? So one of the reasons why we like companies in the US that want to commercialize in Europe and vice versa, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to do that? You increase the universe of investors, you increase the universe commercially, you double your TAM, essentially, right? You increase the universe of strategic buyers. So for us, that is very important. We need to know that it will fit transatlantically.
That's great.
Okay.
Alexander, similarly, your last round was an international syndicate. You raised 48.2 million euros in June of 2023, led by China Grand Pharmaceutical, DaVita Venture Group from the US, and then the European Innovation Council. Can you talk a little bit about how that syndicate came together and how that cross-border sort of played into who you were talking to?
Yeah, no, of course. So, I mean, it came together in different stages, really. In the first stage, we really talked to those investors that at that point were, let's say, the least risk averse, being the investors we already had in the company because they knew us already, and Chinese companies. We ran a structured process in China with 20 companies and then serious discussion with 5, term sheets with 3, and then we picked out the best one. And that was at the point in time where we really didn't have any clinical readouts at all. So, I mean, you couldn't be too risk averse at that point to step in. But then 6 months later, interesting and very good clinical data came out. Then we had a year strategic, DaVita joining, as well as some Asian and European VCs. And then another 6 months later, the EIC, the European Innovation Council, also stepped in because they essentially, well, piggyback on the work of others, and they want to make sure that they want to see who is joining that round, is there good corporate governance, is there good reporting, et cetera. So it came to be in different stages, really. You couldn't do it all together. That would be a huge negotiation mess.
How did you find your potential investors? Did you have connections? How did that process go?
Yeah, well, again, it's a bit of a mix. So when I think of China, as I said, it was really a structured process. Of course, the European VCs, we know most of them, we know them well, or at least have connections with them through our board members or network. And the same was true with DaVita joining. We had a joint contact, and the board was really helpful in making that happen, really, yes. Yeah.
Did you have different asks from your international investors? And how did that differ from Asia to Europe to the US?
Well, absolutely. I mean, so the European VCs act like VCs. DaVita acted mostly like a VC. Of course, had a bit of strategic interest. Wanted to make sure there was value to be created in their markets, not just in the US, but globally, because they are a global player. But then Grand Pharma had a very clear Chinese angle. It was a combined equity and licensing deal where most of the focus was on the licensing part and making sure we created something in China. So the asks were very, very different on that front. Yes, absolutely.
May I add something to
Yeah,
this?
please.
So one thing I would add is that, so we've built syndicates, inside the U.S., U.S. plus European investors. We also just closed the deal that we co-led with a Chinese investor, Yongjin Ventures, in fact. We've done deals with Middle Eastern investors out of Dubai as well, right? In our experience, what is really, really important, and I really take your comment to heart, is that to figure out the fit, figure out that you have a common agenda well before you go and close that deal. A word of warning, all right? So whether you're in Canada and or Europe, there's certain jurisdictions like this that will make matching funds available to you, okay? The tricky thing with these things, not to say that you can't weave them in, right? But the tricky thing with these things is that if you're building a syndicate with local matching fund, but then these funds have a geographic focus, they have an economic development mandate. They may want the company to stay in that particular jurisdiction post an M&A, so they can act as a bit of a fly in the ointment, right, when it's time to strike a deal, right? Those are sometimes tricky things that you have to work out ahead of time. So when you broaden that syndicate, just broadening the syndicate is great as a concept, but then you need to drop down to 1,000 feet and make sure that everything is going to roll in one direction before you get everybody signing on the dotted line.
Does that come back to great legal counsel?
Pardon me?
Does that come back to great legal counsel?
It comes back to great legal counsel.
Well, for full disclaimer here, Rob is an attorney, so that's
Okay.
Yeah.
he's plugging for the profession.
Yeah, that was undisclosed.
David, Luc, have you guys always been cross-border investors, or is this a new thing for you guys? How did that evolve in your investment
Well, as I
careers?
mentioned, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Luc.
As I've mentioned at the beginning, so TVM is transatlantic by the very nature of how it operates, right? So Munich and Montreal. And Montreal is the portal for North America. So, we like to build companies that if they're a US-based company, well, how is this going to fit in Europe? If they're a European company, how is it going to fit in North America? A great example, we just made an investment in a Germany-based company called Smart Reporting, right? The financing is to allow them to buy a business in the US and basically grow from a $10 million to a $25 million top-line revenue as soon as they close on that asset in the US, right? So buying the company is one thing, but then you also need a team in the US, and you'll need to drive more clinical data and everything that ensues from this, right? So working, thinking cross-border is definitely part of our DNA. Cross-border can be Canada, US as well. So we've made investments in Canadian companies. So we tell them the day we make the investment in your company, Canadian company, you become an American company, all right? And so we drive that, in fact, that concept, okay? So yes, so cross-border are us.
So part of your DNA. You've
It's
always been that
definitely
way.
what we like to do.
Yeah. Dave, how about you?
We're just a sprout. I mean, we've obviously Vektor's the centerfold of perfect. We were in a company in Estonia that, it was kind of weird to be kind of Americanized, I guess. We were applying for some EU grants, and the local folks were concerned that we would get a grant and then pluck the company out, move it to the U.S. I mean, I understand the legitimacy there. So we walked away, abandoned the position, but we're still supporting it scientifically, et cetera. So like Luc, we always think about both markets. We think that there's, whatever the U.S. market is, the same market exists here. All of our companies have that eye towards coming across the ocean. I'm here for this meeting because the next fund will have at least a third of that component will be hopefully based here in the EU. And we have a venture partner, I don't know, maybe out there right now.
Right there.
Oh, there he is. There's Laurent. Guest panelist earlier today, who's going to head those efforts up for us. So yeah, we have an eye on the now and the eye on the future.
Great. Alexander, Rob, can you guys talk a little bit about how your companies have changed post cross-border investment? Alex, for you, more of Americanizing or having that American component, and Rob, for you, going international. Alex, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, how have we changed? Well, we have started a pivotal trial in the United States, and of course with that comes a lot of work on market access, on reimbursement, on what does the commercialization plan look like. So that's something we had to do anyway, but of course it's extremely helpful to have a partner like DaVita, who is the second largest dialysis player in the field, in our cap table helping us. I mean, it would just be a much bigger task to do without their help, definitely.
Do you have a U.S. entity or just people?
We have a U.S. entity,
Okay.
yeah.
Do you have an office space or people working remotely? How are you setting that up?
It's very small and it's very limited, but because we're now building the U.S. pivotal trial and more sites come online, of course, the team is going to grow. This is really where the focus is. I don't think the European side is going to grow that much, but the U.S. side is now going to expand very significantly in the coming months, I would say, even.
Fantastic. Rob, how about you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we always contemplated coming to Europe. Part of the Series A round was going to Europe. It's what we talked to David Dare about quite extensively. But the connections and the introductions that Luc has made, including some consultants on the regulatory side, have sped that up tremendously. So we announced earlier today that we're seeking CE mark and hope to get CE mark early next year. That timeline is about a year ahead of when we were forecasting it a year ago. So these connections really matter. And who you sit with and who you talk with really matter. These are two of the gentlemen on my board, and I reap so much information from them every time we speak. Again, it goes back to a dollar is not a dollar and a euro is not a euro. What dollars do you want in? I would recommend experienced, educated, and connected individuals.
What advice would you guys have for people in the audience who are looking to start a cross-border syndicate? Where do you start? How do you start meeting investors from different countries, different regions?
Well, I perhaps need to echo, I think, Luc's comment on you might start with a certain group of investors, but you have to keep in mind who do you want to add to that syndicate and already keep that in mind. I think in our particular case, when we started with our investors, but also the Chinese investor, I mean, if we would, of course, any strategic that comes in is asking for certain rights, which you don't always have to say yes to. Because if you do, that would exclude some European VCs or American strategics if you say yes to that. So you need to have a bit of a mind, a bit of a view on where do I want to go, and make sure the terms you agree in that first phase are palatable for everyone else joining later on.
I also think it's really important to think about a synergy or an alignment of ideation. Where do you intend to go, and where do those individuals who you're bringing on board intend for you to go? And if they're in the same direction, that's fantastic. Build that syndicate. But if they're in opposite directions, as we've alluded to, maybe it's not the best dollar to bring in, because at the end of the day, this is your team. And so due diligence on the front end, making sure they're the right partners for you. In terms of where you meet these, I mean, advertisement for this event, there's incredible funds here throughout who have experience in the medtech industry. I find these events, both in the United States and Europe, to be incredibly helpful for talking to individuals. And I can't recommend, the more people you're in front of, the more you can learn about the process.
I would just echo to that. It's kind of like getting married. Your first wedding night is your best night. It goes down after that.
Significant.
But on a serious note, I think people, whether they're cross-border, cross-town, or across the room, there's similar things. Similar-minded people, similarly informed, seldom disagree. You've heard about visualizing the end. Okay? That goes down to the board level. How's the board dynamics? If you get somebody who's early in a fund, they want to go long. Somebody who's got a year left in their fund, that's a natural mismatch. I mean, I want to sell as fast as I can. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I find whether it's friends, business relationships, syndicates, just start out with those basic things. Are these people that I want to go have a beer with? If the answer to that's no, I probably sure don't want to get in bed with them, putting money into a company that we're going to be tied up for the next 3 to 5 years with. And, you know, it was a little bit of apprehension with you know, because Luc's got such a cool name, and Sasha, and they're doing their diligence, and, you know, we're from the great state of Tennessee, and we're just Dave and Billy Bob and whoever else. And what really struck us was the commonality, putting the patient first, thinking through how that's going to be, the thoughtfulness, sharing diligence. Couldn't have asked for a better syndicate partner. And I really didn't think about it being international. I just thought, what a great group to work with. And so we kind of approach it that way. We want to work with great people, and that includes Rob, you know, why Vektor was appealing to us. So we start with that, and then where the chips fall, they fall.
Yeah, I think I'd pick up on that theme as well, and certainly echo the comments, return the compliment to Dave. So the alignment is key. Let me give an example. Sometimes I think that's useful. So given that we're in Europe, I'll give the example of a typical European medtech company that wants to make inroads in the US, right? So very often what we see are European medtech companies that have built a clinical database, right, in Europe. And they pitch the concept that we're gonna open up an office in the US. We're going to get ourselves a 510K, and Bob's your uncle, your commercial, right? So this is when funds like us can really help. Now, it takes two to tango, because your advice is only as good as the other person receiving it and viewing it as useful, right? But we would discuss the implementation of clinical trials in the US. Because once you've got your 510K, well, how are you going to sell it, right? And then there's not enough time here to get into a lot of details, but how are you going to get that reimbursed? Well, you need not just clinical data to pique curiosity of the healthcare providers to try your device, but how are you going to get that reimbursed? You need an economic value proposition for a third-party payer at some point, right? So all of that machinery, right? Supply chain, etc. You know, 5 years ago, you talk about supply chain, people roll back their eyes. You know, what do you mean supply chain? Well, post-COVID, guess what? Supply chain's a real thing. You better pay attention to that, right? So it's all these little things that add up to a good experience or a Gilligan's Island 3-hour tour that never ends kind of thing, right? So that's one example. But there are plenty of examples of U.S. companies wanting to go to Europe and also kind of doing it a bit clumsily, right? And so that too can be streamlined.
Alex, since none of your board members are on this panel, I'll ask you this question. How is having people in different time zones, like trying to get a board meeting together, like what dynamics does that add to your company? And is it additive? Is it hard? Is it, like, tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, in practice for us, it's now quite easy because we used to have people from the US on the board already, but now we also have people in China. And that actually, those time zones very neatly coincide at 4 p.m. in the afternoon for us. So for us, it's really easy now. But it's a bit more difficult with people in the US and China because of that. But perhaps echoing also what David said, you need to find people with a common way of thinking. And that is perhaps just not as easy as it always sounds. I mean, you also have experience with Chinese investors. I think here, due diligence just becomes a bit more of a two-way street, where it's not just the investor doing the diligence on the company, and there's always a bit of back and forth, but we did intense efforts to make sure that the language barrier, the cultural barrier, geopolitical tensions, IP, wouldn't become a problem. And you do need to spend a bit more time together, and just like in a relationship, really get to know each other, and it should be an effort from both sides.
So you dated a lot.
Sorry?
You dated a lot.
We dated for months and months and months. It never ended until it did.
Tinder for investors.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So this question for all of you, like over the last couple of years with MDR, and MDR being kind of a mess, most companies have a US first strategy. Do you still think that's the best path forward, or is that starting to change? What do you guys think?
Would you like
Well, I mean, we are a European company, so we are a European company first, and we are farther ahead in Europe than in the United States. Pivotal in Europe is almost complete now, and we're starting in the United States. And in a way, that is helping us in the US, because we are now starting the pivotal trial in the United States without having done any prior study there, without having done an early feasibility study, for example. So yes, we have focused on Europe first, but I'm not sure we've lost time in the United States because of that. And I mean, we're also lucky to have been selected for the MDR expert panel, so it's a bit of, MDR is still difficult, there are still uncertainties, let's be honest about that, but we're hoping to get a bit more clarity sooner because of that. It is getting a bit more structured and a bit more clear as it goes.
Yeah, I think that whole like MDR thing, yes, the standard has changed, but I think for the first year and a half, it was more the backlog, right? And so companies like Vektor and others that we have in the portfolio that were looking to even just meet a notifying body that would take them on and take them on on a reasonable timeline was a challenge, right? So this is one of the things that we worked out in Europe. So we've worked with Intertech, by the way, if others are interested, but that's a good body to work with, and they've served us well. But the log jam for the first 12 months for smaller companies, the bigger companies, they got the red carpet treatment. But the young sort of entrepreneurial companies, knocking at the door, Vektor who, right? They basically take a number, right?
So we could have used the Google Maps, since Rob's the Google Maps guy. We saw the traffic jam, just like Waze when it turns red. I mean, you're not moving. And so most of our
Waze.
companies, we started looking for ex-US somewhere in what I would call the southern or northern hemisphere. Doing limited first in human, then rapidly come into the U.S. to do the first in U.S. I mean, in number-wise, maybe 10, 15, then to 20. Always thinking Europe, but, look, we love you all. We're mostly from Europe, but the MDR mess, you got to sort that out. So when you sort it out, then I think we're hoping that the time delay, we can have now, a nice green road and come back in on it. So that's how we're approaching it.
It's a really great question. As an attorney, I'm extremely reluctant to criticize any regulatory body, but I will say that the MDR confusion did lead us to go to the US first. It had been, in years past, easier to start in Europe. That wasn't true when we went through. We went through the United States first with an eye of developing the clinical study so that it could be used for CE mark. I still think some of those discrepancies and difficulties exist, and so for a company who hasn't done it, maybe it hasn't changed, and maybe you should start in the U.S. first, unless you're domiciled in Europe. But there's some things that need sorting out, and I will say for a small company, it is tough to get a notified body's attention. And so again, helpful to have a syndicate partner who can help and make introductions, and you can, I don't know if you realize this, but you can rely a little bit on their reputation. They've taken another company through this notified body. They're taking you through this notified body. That helps.
I think there's another element as well, right? I mean, at the end of the day, entrepreneurial companies have to raise money, right? So if you're spinning your wheels in Europe, but you have a clear path in the US, you should sometimes take the path of least resistance, at least to get going, get some data behind you and so on. And then to some extent, there is far more capital in the US than there is in Europe. The difficulty also in Europe, there's obviously capital in Europe as well, but it can be geographically limited, right? So in the US, if you're based in San Francisco, you're based in Austin, you're based in Boston, and so on, you're doing medical device, you're just a US company. You're not a Boston-based company, so the Minneapolis-based VC cannot touch you, right? So access to capital, access to KOLs, ability to generate data, ability to get a product on market, ability to get it adopted, while the other jurisdiction spinning its wheel, well, that will influence a US first approach.
Do you think that's changing attitudes in Europe about being so specific from geographical perspective?
I don't have enough data points to really have a strong view on that. But I can speak to this company that we've invested in, Smart Reporting, as a case in point, right? So this is a company that's been bubbling along in Europe for a number of years, and what looks like is going to be their coming out party is the acquisition of U.S. assets, right? And them becoming a basically transatlantic company with the U.S. business becoming the bigger anchor for them, right? Now, I don't know if that's representative of the entire landscape, right? But that's one example where they've migrated to the U.S.
Interesting. And how do you think that, regulatory is one thing, reimbursement is another. In Europe, it's very, it's kind of the same in the U.S. because you're dealing with all the different payers.
Yes.
But how does that go in terms of, making inroads in Europe?
Well, we have a secret weapon, Laurent, who helps us here in Europe. Anything we need there, Laurent, you got to fix this. Yeah, the U.S. has such a great repertoire of offerings commercially. Some of them who are here, Veranex, I'm on the board at Veranex, so full disclosure. They can help with regulatory, thinking through marketing, reimbursement strategies, those kind of things. While the U.S. is in one sense fragmented, in another sense, there is some cohesiveness because it's not like you have to reinvent the wheel every single state, every single hospital, every single city. So I think from that standpoint, between the two, we cover it that way. I don't know if that's unique or about like everyone else's approach. But I don't know, Luc, you guys got any other ideas on that one?
Well, reimbursement is a challenge regardless of whether you're on one side of the Atlantic or on the other side, right? In some ways, the U.S. reimbursement landscape, I agree with you, it has a lot of opportunities. It's also fragmented. You have MACs across various regions. That MAC reimburses at $10 a test. The other one, $500 a test. So there are frustrations and challenges in the U.S. as well. In some ways, in Europe, you could also see it as perhaps simplified in the sense that, well, what are your biggest markets? France and Germany, right? You start there. You start in France and/or in Germany and build from there, right? So in some ways, it's also fragmented. It's also bureaucratic and everything else. It's meant to be that way. But then it's also simplified in a way, right? You don't start in a smaller country. You start where the bigger markets are.
Alex, how does that translate to Asian markets? So China.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the honest answer because we have a licensing agreement, of course. So we have someone else taking care of that. Luckily, because we would never go there ourselves, right? I think this is exactly the type of market where you probably need to go with a partner. I can't see us or most Western companies do that without a local partner.
I think you have to do that in those limited markets like that because it's very closed. We've had a couple of companies, and we kind of looked and it's like just threw our hands up and said, okay, running the traps, the politics, all the other things, it's best to get a partner there of some sort.
And speaking of partners, I was going to say that as the small company who is actively going through reimbursement efforts, our strategy reflects exactly what you heard from the two gentlemen over here on my left. In the U.S., we've worked with phenomenal regulatory consultants, including Veranex and others, to help with that, and we're far along on that path. In the EU, we'll be targeting Germany. It's a very sophisticated electrophysiology market, and it'll work well for our initial launch.
And in some ways, just to sort of close one of the loops, so when we did due diligence on Vektor at the beginning, we targeted EPs in France and EPs in Germany. And we wanted to understand what's the standard of care. How would they view this V-mapping technology? Friend or foe kind of thing, right? Show me a little bit of data or show me 10 years of traction, right? And when we realized that it would be, in fact, quite an easy flip based on show me data on anywhere between 25 to 50 cases. That's what they wanted to see, right? That's entirely manageable. But we did focus in Germany and France, and then the reason why we do that above and beyond early due diligence is that once the company is in Europe, we already have access to the KOLs in Germany and in France.
Great. Well, good. getting close to time, so I'd love to end with a round robin on what's your best advice for companies. I know we've covered a lot of territory in the last 40 minutes, but that are interested in doing cross-border syndication. What would you guys recommend? Alex, we'll start with you.
The best advice? Well, the best advice is perhaps to first of all consider cross-border investors. Even if you think certain geographies might be more difficult, think of Saudi Arabia, think of China. The issues that you typically see there, geopolitical tensions, IP, language, culture, these issues might not be insurmountable if you put some work into it. And then it's really thinking about, okay, make sure that the whole still fits together. And not just add-on investors to add-on investors. It still needs to be a whole that works together.
Great.
Yep.
Luc, how about you?
Start early and keep an open mind. One of the things that I find interesting about the medtech industry, so the first 10 years of the almost 30 years in this business as venture capital, I did almost exclusively therapeutics. On the therapeutic side, it's more rigid. It's rigid in the sense that it's more sort of VCs will do venture investments, and it's even further rigid than that sometimes. Where Boston-based venture community, they do Boston deals, and San Francisco-based they do sort of Valley deals and these sorts of things. Right? What I find interesting about the medical device thing is you can get a healthy mix of not just cross-border investors but strategics. VCs, you have now multi-family offices with expertise in medical devices, right? So all of these things blend in and can make a very strong syndicate, but do start early and do keep an open mind as to what that final syndicate is going to look like. It's probably not what you thought it would look like at the beginning of your fundraising.
I don't think I've ever seen one look like what I thought it was going to look like. Echoing on Luc's comment, think about the end, but be careful what you ask for. You could be the little dog that catches the car. Cross-border, is that really necessary now at a Series A? Is it more appropriate in a Series B? I mean, each company is unique, so think those through because everything comes with a cost, whether it's board seats, personalities, all the time zone things you got to manage.
Sure.
So when you're thinking about that, think about how that cross-border formation will help you derive value first and foremost for the company, then secondly for your shareholders, and then most importantly for the patients. There's opportunities, as you see with Vektor, Xeltis, where that's going to help patients all over the world. And they're on steroids. I mean, it's fast. We've cut timelines because of cross-border syndication. If you're looking for seed capital and you're in Munich, or if you're looking for seed capital and you're in Minneapolis, I probably wouldn't be thinking cross-border. I would be just thinking trying to get the right people in the right place at the right time. So a little bit different theme there, I guess, but always thinking about the team, how you build that. That's the most important part.
I think it's all phenomenal advice. I would just say to any innovators out there, if you really care about what you're doing, and you shouldn't be leading an innovative company unless you really care about what you're doing, you're going to work really hard. You're going to do a lot of due diligence. You are going to do diligence on the people you're going to be working with. You'll do due diligence talking to other innovators. Our company's CFO, Doug Goemans, sitting out there, he and I have done thousands of hours of due diligence on these guys, on other funds, where we're headed. Do your work. And if you do that work, you can feel more confident about alignment and where you're headed, and be able to reach those goals that you set out for yourselves.
Well, great. Thank you, guys. It's been a great conversation. I hope it has inspired some of you guys to go out and look at cross-border syndicates, and give everyone a round of applause. Thanks.